DNA certainly can be a very powerful tool in a criminal investigation, but it really needs to be borne in mind that the presence of a DNA profile doesn't necessarily say anything about the time frame or the circumstances under which that DNA arrived at that particular location. You know, I think it's really quite remarkable the role that DNA testing plays these days in the criminal justice system. It would be horribly inappropriate to suggest that that is the most likely hypothesis, right? And there's a large number of alternative hypotheses that should also be considered at the same time. The current DNA testing methodology is completely silent on the tissue source of the DNA. The tests that are done simply say what DNA is present, and they cannot speak at all to what sort of tissue gave rise to that DNA profile. They're completely incapable of distinguishing between DNA that arises from blood as opposed to DNA that arises from saliva or semen or skin or any other biological source that you might think of. You know, I am aware of some instances where in a strangulation cord a DNA profile can be generated, but I would say that that was an unusual circumstance. It would be more likely to not be able to get a DNA profile with conventional tests. I think an amount of saliva that is too small to be seen with the naked eye could deliver that quantity of material. A cough, a kiss, all could very easily deliver that quantity of material without anybody thinking that anything unusual had happened. What needs to be considered, at least, is the possibility that a DNA profile was generated from something such as the defendant's saliva, but that it seemed as if it came from blood, because even though there was saliva present, the blood from the victim was on top of it. It would be very important to bear in mind that that is a very real possibility.
So it might be that in this case the blood is from the victim and the saliva is from Mr. Lauwers.
Certainly. There's an indication of blood and there's an indication of the defendant's DNA. And, you know, it would be inappropriate to say that the DNA came from blood. A blood stain here, for instance, could very easily have transferred over sufficient material for a DNA profile to be generated from this region, even though the blood was originally deposited here and was only later, long after the crime occurred, transferred to here. If the storing of the article of clothing is not very carefully done, that type of transfer is actually not unusual. It is actually the expectation. Well, here I think we see something quite remarkable. In my hand I'm holding a photograph that was taken of this article of clothing when it was found at the crime scene. And here we see a photograph once it's being examined within the laboratory, and there's strikingly obvious differences between what we see within the laboratory and what was actually discovered at the crime scene. Large stains. This one, for instance, that there's no indication of whatsoever in the original photograph, that tells us that whatever information we get from this article of clothing, once it's being tested within the laboratory, is not necessarily, and in fact, I think reasonable to say, not expected to be the same as whatever it was that was deposited during the commission of the crime. This ruler is actually in physical contact with this article of clothing, and this very same ruler we saw in the previous images is in contact with different regions of the article of clothing. At the very least, it speaks to a lack of understanding of the great sensitivity of DNA tests as they're used these days. That type of contact, especially with an article that has this much biological material associated with it, can easily result in the transfer of material from one place to another place just by the movement of that ruler. If the issue here is it's particularly incriminating to find DNA in one place as opposed to another. The capacity to distinguish between, did it come because the ruler moved it there, or did it come because it was deposited during the commission of the crime? The capacity for distinguishing between those two alternatives is completely lost in light of what we see in photographs like this.